Hello, I'm Neil Davidson and I'm the founder of Raw Umber Studios. Welcome to another portrait drawing session. This video mimics the structure of a traditional life drawing class. We'll show you 3 photographs, one for 10 minutes, one for 20 minutes and one for 30 minutes, and it's your job to draw what you see on the screen. Lizette Dingemans will be joining us. For the first 10 minutes, she'll give a talk about one important aspect of portrait drawing. For the second 2 sessions, she'll be drawing along and giving hints and tips. If you're watching this live, you can ask her questions in the live chat and she'll do her best to answer. Obviously, you can draw by yourself or with your family around the kitchen table, or you can start a Skype group chat or a Zoom call or use WhatsApp to draw with your friends and chat with them and then share your work. Once you've finished, don't forget to photograph your work and share it to Instagram and hashtag it with hashtag #RawUmberLive. Right, let's get started.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Raw Umber portrait video. I'm Lizette Dingemans and let's get started with a quick 10-minute tutorial. As Neil has probably already mentioned, we've got 3 poses today. We've got a 10-minute, 20-minute and a 30-minute pose. The way it works, for the first 10 minutes I'm going to start doing a quick tutorial on some techniques that I'll be using throughout the other 2 poses, and then I'll draw alongside with you during the 20 and the 30-minute pose. Last week's portrait session I focused on materials. I'll also link that video down below for people who haven't seen it yet. And today we're going to be speaking about something way more important than how to hold your pencil. It's actually what to draw. Drawing is actually half observing, and when you're observing you have to start categorizing what's important to draw, where to start, and what's also very important to leave out. And that's what we're going to be learning today. So let's start with the real basics. As you can see, I've just drawn an angled line on the paper. Let's just say that this is the jawline or something of the portrait. So if you want to draw that angle, you need to know exactly where it's pointing at. This can be hard to do on its own, but what if you add a horizontal or a vertical line to it? As you can see, the minute I add that horizontal and vertical axis, it's much easier to judge the difference between the angle and the horizontal line. Another thing you can do that helps me is imagine the angle is the hand of a clock. As you can see, the angle I chose is in between 9 o'clock and 12 o'clock, pretty close to 10 o'clock. At first you can maybe draw these circle lines and the horizontal and vertical lines in, but of course that's not really practical to do for every angle you want to draw. What will happen is after a while your brain will sort of train itself to see these lines without needing to actually see them. So let's pretend for a second that this whole circle with the angle is the picture I want to copy. In the past portrait videos, I've spoken about the box a lot, and I always start with top and bottom. So the way to measure those is to hold your pencil vertically, keep your elbow locked and your wrist also quite stiff, and put the point of the pencil on the top line and your thumb near the bottom line of your object or portrait. And then you can just take your pencil over to where your paper is and draw a line where the top of your pencil is and a line where your thumb is located. This same technique works for the width of the circle. This way of drawing, where you're copying directly what you see in the same size, is called side size, and it's used in a lot of ateliers. It's really useful in the sense that if your object that you're drawing is just next to your paper, like for instance my circle is now next to my circle I'm drawing right now, it's really easy to see if you've made a little bit too tall or a little bit too wide, because you can just flick your eye back and forth. So it's a really good way to learn. So let's try the same way with something a little bit more complicated. Remember how I said in the last video how everything you see is just shapes? Well, let's try just drawing just a random scribble and see if we can copy it using this method. So that looks pretty complicated, but what if we just start by just adding that vertical and horizontal line? By putting the shape in a box like that, we can easily measure the top versus the width and just take that over to copy. So again, I'm using the top of my pencil to measure the top of the shape and my thumb to measure the bottom of the shape. You can also use another straight object for this, so for instance a knitting needle or a cocktail stick. So now we can do what we did earlier with the angle. You can compare the angle on the left corner there to the horizontal and vertical lines and just fill it in your box. So this is like how I like to fill in the other shapes. So if you just look at the left chunk there, it's about 1/3 up where it starts and 1/3 down where it ends. So you can just sort of take those lines and bring them into your box as well. And that's how you can break down shapes and copy them accurately. Now this is really useful in the portraits and actually anything you draw. So I would say if you've got a bit of time after this, just spend a little bit of time just copying your own scriggles. And you'll see that this will help with anything you draw, from trees to portraiture to anything you're drawing from observation. Now, as you can see, I just cut through a whole lot of little shapes in that squiggle there. The reason for that is I always try to work with from big to small. That way you don't overcommit yourself to a little small shape and then figure out later that the big shape is completely off. So I always try and simplify as much as I can. If you work from big to small shapes, it's always much easier to sort of hang the little shapes from the bigger shapes rather than have to work around the little shapes to then put the big shapes in. I just want to talk really quick about common mistakes using this method of drawing. When you first start measuring, you base off your measurements of the first line. So your first line is wrong. You may think that this angle is right, and then you might hang off other angles from that. And slowly you get a sort of chain effect where your whole drawing is off. Like for instance, in this little one that I'm doing underneath, you can see I started with the first angle being slightly off and everything else is now angled a little bit more than it should. So the best way to tackle that is by never trusting your own lines and to measure everything from as many different viewpoints as possible. So for instance, from here, I do a bit on the bottom right, and then now I do a bit on the top right. Now, how does all this relate to portraiture? Well, once you get more versed in these angles, it becomes more of a second nature to you. You'll be able to draw more easily, draw shapes more easily, and for instance, draw a box quite quickly. And once you've got a box, we've basically already got a skull and we can just hang the nose and eyes from there. I'll get more into this in the second pose since we're already on 7 minutes. Okay, so for the last bit of the video, for the last 3 minutes, I just want to get into what if you don't have your portrait next to your drawing and you can draw it in the same size. For instance, you want to make your drawing a little bit bigger than the photo you have. Well, in that case, the same method applies, but instead of doing side size, so taking over the exact measurement, we're going to look at how these measurements compare to each other. So for instance, I just measured the top and the bottom, and I saw that the width was a little bit wider than the top. So we're just going to try and emulate that in a slightly bigger size. And as you can see, when I compare my measurements, in the original box, there's a little bit less lead left over, meaning that my box is a little bit too wide compared to the height. So we're going to chop a bit of the right side there. So checking again, now it seems like it's a little bit better. Don't worry if it's not exact. It's quick draw after all, so let's just get it somehow okay and then move on. Now, once I've got my big box in, the rest is just copying what we did before, looking at, is this point halfway of the box, 1/3 down the box? How does the angle compare to the vertical and the horizontal lines? And that's just how you draw any shape. Okay, so just a little final note about this. When you first start learning about measuring, you think you have to measure everything, and it can get a bit difficult to draw quickly. I would advise actually not to measure everything. Draw first, measure second. You might be surprised by how far off you are, and you might think, oh my god, I'm really bad at drawing, blah, blah, blah. The main thing is that every time your eye sees that it was wrong using the measurement, you train your eye to be more accurate. So the more you draw and then measure and correct yourself, the more accurate your eye becomes and the easier drawing will be. Okay, I hope that helped, and I'll see you in a second in the next video. All right, welcome to pose number 2. This will be a 20-minute pose, and then we've got one more pose lined up for you, which is a 30-minute pose. I'll be explaining what I'm doing throughout the video, and I'll be drawing alongside of you. As the video goes on, you might notice that I speak less and less. This is just to sort of give you the freedom to get on with your drawing as well. So remember what I said about drawing the vertical and horizontal lines to be able to see angles a little bit better. I've already just put those down for you so we can just get drawing pretty quickly. So the first thing I always do is check if the head is square, rectangular. In this case, it's a square, so the width is exactly the same as the height. So I started with that, and the next thing I check if there's an angle to the head, which there is, which is why I just sort of angle my plus sign and my width of the box a little bit. Next, I'm going to check what is in the middle of that. So right in the middle of the head, I see the ear, and it goes to about half of the bottom half. Next, I draw in other things that relate to that midpoint. So for instance, the eye sits just above that middle line, and the jawline comes out from the ear towards the bottom right point. I also like to start shading right away because it makes it easier for me to see things as just dark and light shapes. This is optional, and just do whatever is easiest for you. The nose sits nicely in that midpoint of the lower half, so I'm just going to draw that in. It's a good point of reference. I am using the rule of thirds here, meaning that in an ideal face, and this happens not for everyone, but for most people, the nose to the chin is equal to the bottom of the nose to the eyebrow, and the brow to the forehead is equal to that again. And again, I'm just going to shade that in to make it easier for me to see what's what. I always think it's really cool to see how quickly a face starts forming by just drawing some random lines and shapes. Also, don't forget that if you have any questions, you can always ask me something in the comments. And if you want to see me draw again, you can just rewind the actual video. Okay, so now I'm just drawing in the mouth. I often try and find if something is either halfway or 1/3 down a certain space. So in this case, the top lip is 1/3 down from the bottom of the nose to the chin. Now I can just start breaking these shapes down into smaller shapes. So like I said in a 10-minute video, the one before this, I always like starting with bigger shapes and then starting to break down slowly into smaller shapes. One thing to keep in mind with this is that if you commit too much to your small shapes, you might end up spending a lot of time on one particular bit and getting a bit caught up with it. It's better to just do maybe 20 seconds on the nose and then 10 seconds on the eyes and just try and divide your attention throughout the whole drawing so nothing gets left behind. Note that I'm measuring using the method I taught you in the first 10-minute video. You don't have to do this the whole time. It's all like I said in the video. It's best to measure with your eye first. But if you have the time, just double check if your eye was right. Is always useful. And often you will be right, which is a good thing. And sometimes you might have to change a few things. Main thing is not to get discouraged if you realize that something was slightly off. This is all just practice, so main thing is to just have fun with it and do a lot of it. I'm gonna be quiet for a little bit while I break down the shapes, and then we'll pick it back up after that. Okay, so the next thing I'm gonna work with is the mouth area. And what I like to use for that is, you see how at the moment the forehead sort of lines up with the rest of the chin and the lips? Well, if you look at her, you can see that actually vertically her jaw and lips actually stick out a little bit, and that's a really useful measurement to use in a profile portrait. So I'm just going to change that now. Now that lines up a little bit better. So now I've worked on the face a little bit more, but I haven't really worked on the back of the head and the neck, so that's what I'm gonna do next. And as I said in other videos as well, you can just use the rubber to carve out. You don't always have to be perfect from the start. I see the nose sort of lining up from the bottom of the nose to roughly the eye. So that's where I'm gonna place it. Again, as people probably know who've seen a few of these, I like using a brush, but it's completely optional and you can use whatever medium you prefer and like to work in. I'm just using charcoal because it's a little bit easier to see on video rather than pencil. And also, it's just the medium I prefer personally. I'm just going to continue working on the neck and the back of the head for a little bit. So I'll be quiet while I do that. And I hope you're enjoying your drawing too. Okay, so the back of the head is done, and now I'm gonna get back to the features, which is of course the main focal point of the drawing, and I'm gonna start breaking the eye down a little bit more. In the eye, the darkest accents are usually the lash line and the beginning of the eyebrow where the hair are thickest, so that's usually where you can really put a dark shape. And again, also for the eye, just think in terms of shapes. Don't worry about individual lashes at this point or anything like that. If you get all the shapes right, it will start looking like an eye almost magically. Now I'm gonna continue refining the features a little bit for the last 5 minutes, and I'll speak to you again for the last pose. Of course, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask me in the comments. But otherwise, I'll speak to you in 5 minutes. Alright, and so here we are already at the last pose of this hour. I've really enjoyed myself and I hope you have too. So let's get started. Like I did last time, I'm gonna start off with the box. And I'm gonna start with measuring to see if it's a square box or a rectangular box, and what I see is that it's a square box from her hairline to her chin versus the width of her head including the hair. Now, a little side note about measuring. As you can see, when your pencil is close to the paper it becomes smaller. When it's close to your face it's a little bit bigger. So what you want to do is measure from one point and then make a mental note and then put your charcoal down, not walk up to the picture. So like last pose, I'm going to start by dividing my box up into halves, just to make it a bit easier to measure everything. And straight away you can see that the shadow of her nose is bang in the middle. So like we did last pose, I'm going to start by looking at the angle. So I'm trying to find the center line which goes between her brow line and follows her nose to the center of her chin. And I take that angle and I adjust my box according to that. Then I follow that up by finding the bottom of her nose to relation to her chin and her forehead in relation to her nose, and I check if those are all 1/3. This week I'm mainly focusing on measuring and angles and that sort of thing. I'm actually not going to take this drawing very far. I'm just going to focus on how to measure, how to find shapes, that sort of thing, and not really focus on finishing. So you probably know me by now and know that I like to shade quickly. So again, I'm going to start by shading my darks as soon as I can, just because it helps me see the shapes more clearly. And I'm going to start by finding the top lip again. Is the top lip 1/3 from the bottom of the nose to the chin, or is it halfway? I think it's 1/3. And like I said, you don't want to stay with one bit too long. So after I find the lip, I immediately move on to find the widest point at the face. And the way I measure it, I see it's about halfway. Just cleaning up some lines there, and let's move on to the side of the face. Now when you want to know how big the angle is, just remember what we were doing earlier with the vertical line. You can either draw or imagine a vertical line there, and that should help you to see the angle. Maybe think of the clock again. And this goes for any angle, not of course only the side of the face. Keep in mind that a face is symmetrical, so if an angle is a certain way on one side of the face, it should also be the same way on the other side of the face. So always relate both sides of the face to the center line and see if they line up properly. I'm just quickly gonna shade in the side plane of the face there. Another thing you can do with measuring is you can relate things that are quite far away to each other. So for instance, her hair is the same length as her top lip. So that's what I use to figure out how big her hair is. You can also see how things line up. So for instance, the side of her chin where the shadow starts is directly underneath the side of her nose there. So that's a useful thing for me to figure out where that is. See if you can find some things that can line up vertically or with the center line and see what you can find. I'll be drawing for a bit and I'll get back to you in a second. Did you find any interesting lineups? Well, don't worry if you didn't. It's all practice anyway. Let's move on to the eye sockets. To me, the bottom of her eyes are halfway from the top of her hair to her chin. Now, the eyes or the eye sockets are deeper set than the forehead and the cheekbones, so usually I just end up shading them in. This is because I find it much easier to then go in with my rubber and take the lights out rather than having to put all the little dark details in. And it's a receding plane anyway, so it makes sense. Okay, so I think I'm gonna let you draw for a little bit and break down your shapes, and I'll speak to you in a bit and see how it went. Okay, so I hope you're all having fun. I'm now going to start putting some information on the shadow side of her face. So I'm going to try and figure out where her hair is and where exactly the side of her face starts and where the hair starts. So I'm going to start at a point where the division between her skin and her hair is exactly halfway in the shadow, because that's an easy place to start. Once I got that angle in, and I also know where her widest point of her face is, then I can start finding the other angles of her jawline and her forehead, as well as her hairline. Now I'm just going to draw that in, but in the meantime I can chat to you a little bit about finish. Now in this drawing, or any of these drawings this week, we're not really focusing on finish that much. And the reason for that is because the theme of this week is really just how to draw shapes. But let's just say that I had an extra half an hour or something. Finish just something that you can put on top of a drawing. Once you got your shapes there, the finish is a lot easier. Rather than if you start with a finish and your shapes are off, it's going to look like a beautiful eye, but in completely the wrong place. So I would always say shapes are a little bit more important than finish. I'll address this more in the coming weeks as well. In the meantime, let's see how far we get with the shape, shall we? Okay, so let's try and finish this. Let's break down some of the shapes and the features like we did last pose as well. I'm going to draw these a little bit more clearly than I normally would, so the drawing may look a little bit cartoony. I just want to emphasize the drawing, the shapes a little bit more than I normally would. Okay, so first up, you can also take vertical measurements and make them horizontal. So for instance, I take the chin to the bottom of the nose, and that is the same as the side of the nose to the side of the face there. Which means that my nose is a little bit too far to the left. Now, when this happens, and this happens to anyone, like I said, your measurements aren't always really correct. What I like to do is to just go in quite harshly, try not to hesitate, and just go for it. And that way you go through the awkward phase as quickly as possible. Like I said, it doesn't matter if you make some mistakes. It's actually, it makes you human. You're not a robot. The main thing is that I like to work with error margins. So for instance, at the start, I could be at least a centimeter off of my drawing, but as I near the end, I want to be more and more precise. So then it becomes more important how accurate I am. So as you can see, I'm now trying to just double check that all my angles in the nose and the other areas are absolutely correct. And I'm trying to get closer and closer to what I think is the right place. Okay, so it looks like we've got about 5 minutes left. I'm gonna keep drawing and I'm gonna try and keep refining my shapes, and I'll speak to you near the end. All right, so it seems like we are almost done. I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And otherwise, I will see you next week for another portrait session.
Thank you for taking part. Don't forget to post your work on Instagram and tag it with hashtag #RawAmberLive. I'd like to thank Lizette Dingemans for doing the drawing demonstration, and you can download photographs of the model from the link I'm about to show you on the screen. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram. We're Raw Amber Studios. I'm going to run this every Sunday as long as the current situation continues, so I'll see you next week.